Well, good morning, everybody. What we're going to cover today is we're going to finish up the theory side, or the theories undergirding diversity research. The theory I want to talk to you about right now is what's known as critical race theory. And critical race theory emerged in the 60s and 70s. It's by a law professor by the name of Derek Bell out of NYU. And critical race theory, it's controversial. There's strong advocates behind critical race theory, but then there's a lot of people who are proponents to critical race theory. And basically what critical race theory does is it challenges white norms and assumptions about society. And in a way, it challenges how what is called whiteness is just sort of pervasive through our institutional structures, whether it be the legal system, the educational system, the marketplace, where this idea of whiteness is the norm and everything else is sort of deviant. And I'm going to show a video clip from Gloria Ladson-Billings, who looks at critical race theory in education. And this is really just to give one slice of what critical race theory is in the field of education. And then we're going to talk more about it and also look at people who would have a different perspective on critical race theory.
So critical race theory is a legal perspective that argues that racism is normal, not aberrant in U.S. society. Now, people hate that I say that. They hate it. But that's what critical race theorists believe. So that when racial incidents happen, we go, duh, because they happen all the time. Now, while it is true that we will rally around major incidents like what's now happening in Sanford, Florida around Trayvon Martin, it's really not that people deal with. What they deal with are what I call the 1,000 daily cuts, the everydayness of it. The going into a store, looking at a purse in a display case and being told, that's very expensive. As if to say, you can't afford this. I tell my students all the time, if you knew how much expensive crap black women have, they don't really want to buy it, but someone said, oh, that's expensive. And so in some ways, we get goaded into buying it because it's like, well, I can afford this. It's those things day in and day out, someone's inability to look you in the face, someone not trusting you over something, clutching their purse. I mean, I have 3 sons who are 3 of the most lovely young men you ever wanted to meet. But if they get into an elevator, it's not unusual for somebody to clutch their purse and assume the worst. So that's really about the dailiness, and that is, quote, normal. It's not aberrant. It's not like, oh, we had a racial incident. We have them all the time. It further argues that narratives, or more specifically counter-narratives, are useful ways of understanding how racism operates and functions. So in other words, people tell stories to tell what happened and to try to set a context for how racism impacts them. Critical race theory also employs critical social science as a knowledge base rather than just case law, because remember, this is scholarship that comes out of legal scholarship. But these are legal scholars who are also using social sciences. They're using political science and sociology and anthropology and psychology. And it contends that civil rights legislation only survives if it can advantage whites, and that for people of color to benefit from legislative and policy decisions, they have to find an interest convergence, a way to make the interests of people of color intersect with those of whites. So you have a picture there of Derek Bell, who is the person who developed the notion of interest convergence. Actually,
That's just a quick clip to just perhaps introduce you to critical race theory or display it to you from a different angle. And so this idea of even critical scholarship, the posture of a critical scholar is someone who doesn't just take at face value the assumed history of intellectual knowledge or the history of science, but they take a critical approach of saying, what are the underlying assumptions or what are the power structures that have put these prominent ideas in place? And so a critical scholar is one who comes in with a critical lens of trying to sort of say, well, what are the origins of this line of thinking or reasoning? And the reason why this emerged out of the legal field was that the assumption was that the law and the implementation of the law was neutral, that the law was colorblind, like the law was not racist in its structure. But what Derek Bell and others pushed back on was saying, well, actually, the law and its implementation is skewed to favor white people over non-white people, and challenged this idea that the law is neutral, that the law is colorblind. And this then spread into other fields of education. Is the educational system neutral? Is it sort of equally available and accessible to all? Or is it still skewed towards certain populations or favoring certain populations? And so this whole idea of critical race scholarship, or another way of looking at it is critical whiteness scholarship, where it looks at the pervasive ways that the whiteness of culture is pervasive and normative, and everything that is outside of the white norm is viewed as deviant or aberrant. This is a growing and popular form of scholarship, but it is not viewed favorably by all. And so I want to show an opposite perspective. And actually I found this video fascinating because it basically undermines a lot of the things that I'm trying to communicate in this class and challenges this whole idea of promoting diversity. And so I think it's a very helpful thing to be aware of, because a lot of you have said, who wouldn't want diversity? Or who wouldn't want to have a very diverse workforce or workplace? And this video will give you a perspective of someone who would say, actually, pursuing diversity might not be the most beneficial thing.
Are colleges across America rife with racism, sexism, and homophobia? If you answer, no, that's absurd, you probably have a fair amount of common sense. If you answer, yes, you're probably a college administrator. Wait, you might ask, college administrators accuse their own schools of being racist, sexist, and homophobic? How does that make any sense? To understand how a college administrator thinks, you must first, as the popular saying goes, follow the money. If you do, you will not only discover why college administrators declare their own colleges racist, sexist, and homophobic, but also why, if you're a student, your tuition keeps going up, and why, if you're a parent, your bank balance keeps going down. Here's how it works. If colleges are racist, sexist, and homophobic, the only way to change that, if you're a college administrator, is to create a massive diversity bureaucracy. And that, of course, is massively expensive. No institution provides a more vivid example than the University of California, a once great university system which is self-destructing in the name of diversity. The diversity ideology has encroached upon every aspect of the University of California's collective psyche and mission. It is the one constant in every university endeavor. It impinges on hiring, distorts the curriculum, and sucks up vast amounts of faculty time and taxpayer money. Even the university's ongoing budget problems have not touched it. Since 2010, UC San Francisco, UC San Diego, and UCLA have all created new vice chancellorships in diversity, equity, and inclusion, with salaries starting at $250,000 a year or higher. Each of these new posts is wildly redundant, yet each new diversity position inevitably generates an even greater surge of junior bureaucrats, all sucking in tuition dollars. In 2011, UC Berkeley's Vice Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion presided over a staff of 17. Yet just 1 year later, his staff had ballooned to 24. No wonder the number of administrators at the University of California almost equals that of the faculty. Here's an only partial list of the diversity bureaucracy at UC San Diego. The Associate Vice Chancellor for Faculty Equity, the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Diversity, the Staff Diversity Liaison, the Undergraduate Student Diversity Liaison, the Graduate Student Diversity Liaison, the Chief Diversity Officer, the Director of Development for Diversity Initiatives, the Director of the Cross-Cultural Center, the Director of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender Resource Center, the Director of the Women's Center. These diversity bureaucrats place nonstop pressure on departments to hire on the basis of race, gender, and sexual preference. Their trick is to set the hiring bar low enough to scoop in more female and minority candidates, and then declare that anyone above that bar is qualified enough to trump the most qualified candidate, when that candidate is a white or Asian male. But sometimes even that evisceration of standards isn't enough. In that case, the administration simply creates a new hiring category. In September 2012, after UC San Diego's electrical and computer engineering faculty refused to hire a mediocre female professor whom the administration had tried to force on them, the engineering school announced that it would be creating a, quote, excellence position, the school's Orwellian phrase for women and minorities who cannot get hired even after hiring standards have been lowered. Remember, these machinations are all in the service of a problem that doesn't exist. It's entirely fabricated. UC's campuses, like colleges throughout America, are easily the most welcoming and inclusive social environments in human history, at least if you're not a conservative. Female and minority students are surrounded by caring adults who are dedicated to their academic success. They enjoy opportunities for learning and self-development that are the envy of the world. As for the faculty, the idea that any academic department would reject the most qualified candidate simply because that candidate was black, Hispanic, female, or gay is absurd. Not to mention an entirely gratuitous insult to every faculty member on the hiring committees. Universities should be the institution in society that is the most dedicated to reason and evidence-based decisions. But with their crusade against their own make-believe racism and sexism, UC and almost every other American university betray that ideal every day. I'm Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute.
Any reactions to this video where you either resonate with some of the things that are said, or some of it seems true and valid, or certain things where you're like, yeah, but Olivia?
Well, I was just kind of confused what her stance was on it. It kind of seemed like she was being hard on them, but then at the end she said they're some of the most accepting, or one of the most accepting states in terms of diversity, so I didn't really understand what her viewpoint was.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, to be honest, a lot of this stuff, like critical race scholarship and what she presented, is very hard to get your mind around. Like, you're actually trying to figure out, well, is she for it or against it? Or like the previous woman said that racism is normal. And it's like, okay, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Like, she seems presented as maybe a good thing, but, you know, and so that's a great question that you're asking, and it's not easy. I think what the second woman was saying is that there's all this energy and emphasis placed on creating a more diverse faculty and staff at the university because the underrepresented students need people of color or minorities in places of authority to care for them. And what she's saying is there's already people in place who care for these underrepresented students. So the idea of trying to reallocate all these resources to hiring what she would describe as underqualified or lower quality faculty and staff is unnecessary. It's a waste. It's a huge waste of resources because there's already, the people who are already at the university are doing a fine job caring for the underrepresented students or minority students. So she's basically saying you don't need to go out of your way to hire specialists because the people who are already there are doing a fine job. That's her assertion. Any other this is, again, hopefully the safe environment to ask your questions that you're not clear about, or, so what Olivia said is a great question. It's like, wait, this didn't make sense. Because when you get in your workplace, it's going to be hard to ask these questions. Ewan?
I mean, it kind of seemed like she was all for, like, diversity, but, like, for all the universities in California, it seemed like she was saying, okay, they're trying to overcompensate just to not try and offend anyone necessarily. If it was just, like, whites, for example, like, all in positions of, like, bureaucracy, like, everything would be okay.
So you're saying that you got the impression that she was for diversity, but saying that you don't need to reorganize all the leadership structure in order
just
to
try to not offend anyone.
Yeah.
So to speak.
Again, there's potential mixed messages that come through. Obviously, she didn't say, I'm against diversity, but she did imply that she's against diversity initiatives, in a sense. Like, that's, again, a waste of resources. I mean, her main argument was, we're going way out of our way to create a very diverse leadership structure within the universities. And she's saying, let's just hire the best qualified candidate who comes through the door. Luke?
I don't understand how she could have such a strong viewpoint on the subject with her being white and not coming from a different ethnic background, someone that actually faces discrimination. She's white and she has such a strong viewpoint on the subject.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's kind of funny to me.
Yeah. It's not an accident that it was a white woman presenting. I think it'd be even a stronger critique if it was a white male.
Yeah, that'd be worse.
And a lot of times you'll see similar videos or promotions with a black female or a black male, because there are definitely people from all different races and ethnicities who have the perspective of being against affirmative action or against diversity policies. And I think it is, particularly for me, more compelling when you hear someone of a minority group advocating, I'll say I don't want to say they're anti-diversity, but basically they're anti-giving special preference based on race or ethnicity. So in a sense, because universities still are white male-dominated, actually her being a white female giving this argument gives her actually a little bit more credence. But you're right, she's still white, and she still gets the social benefits of being white. Corey, did you have a response to it?
I was just gonna say, she was bashing diversity. She was saying college campuses are so welcoming and friendly the way it is, and there's not a lot of discrimination on the campuses the way it is, and that list of positions that just takes all taxpayer money. I understand what she's saying. It's kind of way overkill.
You were sympathetic towards her argument in the sense that, it seems like overkill in the university.
She's just saying, there's no need to go this far when it's already, a welcoming place, you know what I'm saying? It's not you know what I'm saying? It's not if you go to IU, you don't really, I'm sure there's discrimination, but it's a pretty welcoming place, pretty inclusive, I would say.
Yeah. Well, and let's open that up, and potentially the best people to respond are the ones who are underrepresented on this campus. What's your assessment of IU in terms of its welcomingness, inclusiveness, or where your voice and your perspective is equally shared? How would you guys assess it? And I'm actually probably asking the underrepresented people, because the highly represented people would say, of course, I feel very comfortable here. These are my people. Mercedes.
I was it's not with me. There's not many black people here, speaking for the culture here. But it's not very, inclusive. So it's very segregated. I think if you look at it more generally, and we have what we call Black IU. So Black IU has its own kind of culture, separate from just IU as a whole. But as far as discrimination, I'm more comfortable here because, like I said before, I went to an all-white high school and an all-white middle school, so my experience here is different from a lot of other black people that came from like all black high schools or ones that are of a good mix. And so a lot of my friends say like when I came here it was a big culture shock, but for me it wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of like on a base by base experience. I mean, of course, all black people are not the same, but I think as a whole, I think there is quite a bit of like separateness and discrimination here at IU. It's just in very small bits and pieces, and it happens rarely sometimes. But I mean, sometimes it's really extreme, but you just don't hear about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. At my university that I came from at Duke, I don't know if you guys heard about it, but just last year, a student hung a noose on campus, right on the center square of campus, just hung a noose. And this is the South. And imagine what that experience was like for particularly black students walking onto campus and being aware that there's at least one person on this campus, and probably more, who share this perspective of intimidation and violence towards a particular group. As a white student, I was kind of like, okay, this was like, what, a fraternity prank, or, you know, what was this? But for the African American students on that campus, it's a chills of horror, of just like, goodness, this is just wrong. Now, I don't know, it isn't representative of all the white students on campus, but just the fact that it actually happened. Like you said, Mercedes, there's incidences, and sometimes they're not widely publicized, but they happen, and it affects the day-to-day experience of students on campus. And campuses, I would agree, are probably the more welcoming and inclusive places in the country, but even on these campuses, there's still incidences of discrimination or racism or bias or threats or violence that are targeted. Zach?
I'm in a fraternity where the philanthropy is the elimination of prejudice,
Uh-huh.
and we're working on a wall that we're creating where people can come up and write words that they've experienced that have felt prejudice towards them or something, anything of that nature. And we've already had a white supremacy group say that they're going to come riot and protest the event.
Uh-huh.
So there's a long way for like inclusion to be
Sure.
a big thing if there's that going on here.
Yeah, yeah. So where's the wall?
It's going to be pretty much in front of Ballantyne.
Uh-huh.
I think we're going to be moving it around a little bit, but
Yeah.
Showalter Fountain, just like all over the place.
And it's an opportunity for students to express where they've felt discriminated against.
Right, and then at the end of the week, we're going to sell hammer hits on the wall, and the proceeds are going to benefit Special Olympics and the Elimination Prejudice Foundation for people to go up and like destroy the wall.
Yeah, yeah. Zach brings up a very good point that I imagine most of you in this room say, well, I'm not racist, and I'm not going to go hang a noose on campus, or I'm not part of any white supremacist group. And it's probably true. Like, white supremacists are a very small, very, very small percentage of the population. Now, they're a loud voice, and, you know, whenever they act, it's highlighted by the media. But it's a strange thing then for, I'll say, the rest of the population is to know how to deal with that, because you could sort of say, well, that's just these crazy white supremacists. I'm not that, and you sort of move on. But what critical race theorists would argue is that this huge middle ground are passive bystanders, or just tacit consent of these what would be called racialized structures that bias one group over another group. And I wrestle with this. I'm in the dominant position, and what's the incentive for me to rock the boat or to change the system? And a lot of this discourse on managing diversity or promoting diversity is asking me to do the hard work of, one, recognizing where I'm biased, and then actually changing my behavior. Because my behavior isn't overtly racist. It's these, what was called microaggressions or racism without racist, like just sort of these implicit biases that we have in our everyday practices. And I wrestle with this, like what is sort of the moral or ethical motivation to care? Because I'm actually doing pretty well under this system, under this regime. And that's why it perpetuates itself. And so when we talk about managing diversity, I've been very impressed with your comments in the memos of like, I can't believe discrimination is still going on, or I can't believe that an employer would discriminate based on race or gender, or it's amazing that the salary gap amongst black people versus white people, like I can't believe that's going on. But it is, and it's being perpetuated by people like us. You know, it isn't necessarily being perpetuated by the white supremacists. They're not the predominant owners of industry in America. It's just everyday people like us. And so part of it is like, why is this sort of in place and why are we perpetuating it? And should we intervene in some proactive way? Because it's not, my contention is that it's not just going to fix itself. It's not like, well, we just, as soon as we get enough educated people, or as soon as enough time has elapsed from slavery, then it's going to right itself. It's like the system's in place, and the system is going to perpetuate itself until there's proactive action to actually go about changing it. What the woman was talking about with diversity and her critique of all these diversity initiatives, I wanted to do a quick exercise where we list out, you know, thinking of IU in particular, list out all of the departments and centers and programs that target or specialize underrepresented populations on campus. So I think like one thing that she said was like a women's center. Women's center, they might not be underrepresented proportionally, but minority doesn't, it isn't just about minority, it's sort of the dominant versus non-dominant. So we have a women's center. What are some other either departments, like academic departments, or centers or programs?
So Gay and Lesbian Center.
Gay and Lesbian Center. Olivia.
Let it know if this is what you mean, but there's like a Black Greek system.
Black Greek system.
I think there's a Latino house also on Center.
Okay. Latino House. Is there a center for students with disabilities? Think about academic programs too. What are some majors that you could select or put or programs where you could take courses? You guys know better than I can
Like
say.
Women's Studies.
Women's Studies, okay. Yes.
African American and African Diaspora Studies.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure there's an Asian Studies department.
Asian Studies, okay.
Gender Studies.
Gender Studies. And so what the woman who shared, her contention would be, this represents a lot of resources being allocated towards creating additional spaces for select students on campus when the campus already has a Greek system. Why do we need to allocate the resources for a Black Greek system or an Asian Greek system? And when you do that, it isn't just, oh, well, it's self-sustaining. You actually have to hire people at the university level to manage these different centers or departments or programs. If you start up a gender study, you need to create the infrastructure to operate a gender study program. And the contention would be that this is a massive resource drain for a university to create all of these. Because where does it end? Like every minority or underrepresented group would say, where's my space on campus? And so on one level, you could look at this and say, yeah, that is kind of crazy. I mean, this is just going to continue to balloon and explode. And as Corey was saying, where's it going to end? I mean, it's just sort of like you can slice it up so many different ways. Now, what a critical race scholar would view this, how they would view this, is they'd say, well, this looks persuasive, and it seems kind of straightforward that, yeah, this is a big waste of resources that we can't afford, and it's basically hurting then the vast majority of students who aren't necessarily benefiting from having a center for students with disabilities. All the students who don't have disabilities are sort of losing resources as a result. But what they would contend, or how a critical scholar would look at this, is say, so remember, critical scholarship or critical whiteness scholarship would say that whiteness is the norm. It's sort of the dominant way of how systems work. And so if you think about fraternities, we don't call it the white fraternity system. It's just, that's what fraternities are. And then if you deviate from that, it's the black Greek system, or black fraternities. But the norm, when you say fraternity, is white. And if you have a critical lens, you begin to see, oh yeah, the Greek system isn't open and accessible to all students. It's generally biased towards white students. But it gives the impression when we say fraternities, it sounds neutral. I mean, it's not racist. It's fraternities. Whereas it actually almost sounds racist to say black fraternities or black Greek system. And so when there's things like fraternities or a Greek system, the critical scholar would say, yeah, it's not colorblind. It's the white Greek system. Or if you think of like history department. History is history, right? History is neutral. It's colorblind. But a generation ago, when you go into a history department, you would hear a predominantly white, male-oriented portrayal of history and how things unfolded. It was, and we wouldn't call this that, it was the white history. But, you know, there's no university in the country that would have a white history department. But in practicality, that's what history departments were. They were history according to the white person's perspective. And so then when you have African American and African diaspora studies, what that's trying to do is insert into that regime a different perspective. And so it almost might sound racist to say, to have an African and African American studies department. It's like, wow, why do they get special attention? Well, it's when you recognize that the long-standing, already established departments are the white English department or the white history department. It would be very interesting if we took this label onto every sort of academic department on campus and just added the word white in front of it and see how true that actually is. And then what that does is it creates an understanding of why you might have specialized groups and centers so that the voice and the representation of these different minority groups is heard and valued and promoted. So even like the Center for Students with Disabilities, it's basically, most of the campus is designed and oriented for students with abilities, like able-bodied students. But we wouldn't call this Indiana University for Able-Bodied Students. You know, it's just part of the assumed thing. Like, you have to be able-bodied to function on this campus, unless someone advocates and represents for students with disabilities to make it accessible to students with disabilities. And so, when you think about diversity, a lot of the critiques of pursuing diversity come from people who have this orientation that the universities or the workplace are open and accessible, like they're neutral, they're colorblind, when in reality, what's woven in there is sort of these white-based assumptions that are actually just viewed as normal. Like, that's just the way it is. We have a Greek system, and we have community centers. We have the student center. You know, that's what 3 generations ago you had the student center on campus. It was the student center. Why do you need all these other Latino house and gay and lesbian center and all these other specialized centers? Because we have a student center. Isn't that enough? What we forget, though, is it's the white student center, like the de facto white student center. and it's designed and organized to facilitate and promote a white-centered culture. And that's not bad, it's just sort of recognizing that it functionally is the white student center. Olivia?
So, just going back to the video about the California schools, so was she talking about them implementing groups like the ones we have on the board? Like, in her opinion, would we be, our university would be the ones wasting those same resources? Or were they going to be groups like the ones we have already?
Yeah, well, and so what we're showing is the on-the-ground programs and centers, but what she was talking about is at the administrative level. So you have a dean for diversity initiatives, and you have, and basically she was saying, even to have this in place, you need to hire administrators to administrate all these programs and initiatives. And so maybe you might say, well, gosh, a lot of these are just student-run things, and so they don't cost the university any money. But actually, there's administrators, and then especially if you're talking about academic departments, you have to hire faculty, tenure-track faculty. You have to hire a chair of the department, and then a dean to oversee all these different programs, which is where a lot of the resources, where it costs a lot of money to have that. I say all this in the sense of there are reasons why not discrimination persists, but where inequality persists. Because there are people who would say, it costs a lot of money to promote diversity. And when you have people in a budget crisis who are saying, well, do we open up a new center or do we cut funding for certain centers? It's hard for some people to see, well, why do we need all these different centers? But I think a valuable exercise is to take a lens of critical race scholarship or critical whiteness scholarship and say, how many of these things are sort of set up and put in place that just inherently are biased or benefit the white population more than other populations? And I'm using race a lot, but it's not just that. It could be gender bias. It could be U.S.-born versus immigrants. So if English is not your first language, are there certain systems in place that bias people where English is their first language? So how do we come to a perspective where we might see that, oh yeah, there probably is value in having a Latino house because the other general spaces on campus or the student center are not necessarily as welcoming or hospitable to a Latino student who's coming to our campus. And this is where I want to bring up another theory which relates to critical race theory, and it's called standpoint theory. And so standpoint theory, it's actually one of those theories that sort of makes intuitive sense. It's based on the way I see and interpret the world is based on my standpoint. So I look at the world from the standpoint of my social position as a white male professor. That's my standpoint for viewing the world. Different people from different social positions have a different standpoint. And so they might look at it from this direction. And what they see is something different. Now, the white male standpoint is the dominant standpoint, and that's sort of the normal standpoint, and that's sort of how history unfolded, and that's how universities were established, and that's how departments developed their curriculum. It's the white male standpoint. But there's obviously other standpoints, different ways of looking at a situation or an experience, but the alternative standpoints don't always get verbalized. They don't always get heard. And so there's a great clip from the movie Crash which highlights just this idea of standpoint theory. It's one scenario where they're in a restaurant and the person is saying, this was my experience in the restaurant, and it's driven out of my standpoint as an African American male, whereas maybe a white male who is in that same restaurant having a different standpoint would not see the things that the African American male saw in the same scenario, the same experience, but based on your standpoint, that determines how you see or interpret a situation.
Did you see any white people in there waiting an hour and 32 minutes for a plate of spaghetti? Huh? And how many cups of coffee did we get?
You don't drink coffee, and I didn't want any.
Man, that woman in there poured cup after cup to every single white person around us. But did she even ask you if you wanted any?
We didn't get any coffee that you didn't want and I didn't order. And that's evidence of racial discrimination. Did you notice that our waitress was black?
And black women don't think in stereotypes? That waitress sized us up in 2 seconds. We're black and black people don't tip. So she wasn't gonna waste her time? Now somebody like that, nothing you can do to change their mind.
So, how much is you need?
You expect me to pay for that kind of service? What? What the fuck is you laughing at, man?
I'm seriously starting to think that you're jealous of Karen.
Hardly. I'd just like to see you get through a meal without calling her or anyone else for that matter.
Okay, look, no more phone calls now. As a matter of fact, here, you can hold the battery. Okay?
$10 says she calls in the car.
Wait. See what that woman just did? You see that?
Why, she's cold.
She got colder as soon as she saw us, though.
Oh, man, come on, don't start.
Man, look around you, man. You couldn't find a whiter, safer, or better lit part of this city right now. But yet this white woman sees 2 black guys who look like UCLA students strolling down the sidewalk, and her reaction is blind fear?
With standpoint theory, which I think is extremely valuable in terms of when we talk about managing diversity, it helps for me to make tangible the value of having diverse perspectives. So if I'm leading an organization, I need to recognize that I have a limited scope or perception or interpretation of reality. Like I am inherently limited by my social position. It influences the way that I view the organization, the way I view leadership meetings or development or training or holiday or sick pay or all these different things. It's very much biased by my social position. The value of having a diverse workforce is that you bring into the conversation multiple standpoints. And multiple standpoints allow you to see reality from a different perspective. It's all the same situation, but it's very different ways of interpreting it and understanding it. And even in the clip with Crash of the 2 African Americans, it's not straightforward. I mean, it was good to have the other guy sort of challenging what he was saying. He's like, well, you don't like coffee. Yeah, but they didn't offer me coffee. Or, how much did you end up tipping? Well, but that's because, so it's not just these straightforward things, but it's being in dialogue and giving voice to these different standpoints. Now, the uniqueness and the value that underrepresented or minority people bring to the table is that they're actually bicultural or bilingual oftentimes. They know how to navigate both worlds. So, in a sense, someone in the dominant culture, this is very true in the U.S., we typically only speak English. You go to any other part of the world, they are multilingual. They know multiple languages, and so they can go in and out of cultures more easily because they've had to learn multiple languages. And same is true with someone who's a minority or underrepresented person in the U.S. They're bicultural or bilingual in the sense that they know how to operate in a white-dominated setting, and they know the social cues and sort of how to operate and how to navigate those settings, but they also are familiar with the setting that's their home culture and places where they understand the uniqueness within a minority setting. And so that person can be a translator to the organization because not only do they know the home culture, but they can also translate it to make sense in the white-dominated culture. And so that person is actually very valuable because not only do they have unique insight, but they have the capacity to translate it to someone who might not be aware of it. So I think my experiences with talking with Asian American students is phenomenal to hear about whether it be the family structure and the respect towards parents or wanting to honor parents and how that is very, very different from the way I was raised in the sense that my parents were like, they cultivated the sense of independence and go off and do whatever you want Whereas I talk with a lot of, say, my Chinese American friends, and it's the intense pressure they feel to follow a certain vocational path, not because it's what they want to do, but it's what they feel will be most honoring and respectful to their parents. And that shapes how they make career decisions, or even what major they're going to select. And so there actually could be value in having, let's say, an Asian American center or someone of Asian American descent in the career development office, so that when that student comes in and says, you know, my parents want me to be a doctor, but I'm actually thinking I want to major in history. In a sense, someone from a white standpoint would be, well, then major in history. Do what you want to do. Like, this is your life. This is not your parents' life. Whereas if you had someone who is of Asian American descent, could sit there and say, wow, I get it. I get the tension that you're living with of wanting to honor your parents and yet also wanting to pursue your passions. And it's not an easy decision, because it could actually mean pursuing your passion results in your parents disowning you or your parents being ashamed of you. And to live in the existence of a reality of your parents not being proud of you could be really hard for the next 30 years of your life. But it's all about the standpoint. And some people see certain things that others don't, and so there's value and importance on multiple levels. And I think a lot of it comes from recognizing this idea of standpoint, that we all, based on our social position, that influences the way we see reality or see situations. So that kind of covers a lot of the stuff on the theory behind diversity research, and we're going to be weaving this into the remainder of the course.